Today we're pleased to offer Collecting Student Feedback Through Class Representatives by Dr. Heather Addy and Matthew Chu, a Bachelor of Science student from Biological Science at the University of Calgary. This is the first session in the Making Sense of Student Feedback series. Dr. Heather Addy has collaborated with the Taylor Institute for over a decade and has generously shared her class representative experiences and resources. A list of these resources will be available at the end of the session. I'm also pleased that to announce that Dr. Heather Addy is a member of the University of Calgary Teaching Academy and a recipient of the University of Calgary Teaching Award. Matthew Chu was a class rep in Bioscience 2021, and we will be hearing more about their experiences and their sharing of their information for us all and for our learning. So thank you. We look forward to hearing from our presenters. I'm going to turn it over to Heather now, and she has a PowerPoint to share with us.
Thank you all for joining us today. As Cheryl said, I'm Heather Addy. I am now retired from the Department of Biological Sciences, where I taught for 24 years, starting in 1998, teaching a range of classes, starting when I first was hired in the large first-year classes. To change that because I don't see anybody else, of 400 students in a lecture theater, to some smaller classes, but often I was teaching classes of around 100, 150. So most of my experience was with large classes, and I will turn it over to Matthew to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew, and I am a fourth-year student in biological science, and I served as a class rep for Dr. Addy in the fall 2021 semester for her Bio 435 class. And if all goes well this year, I am on track to graduate this spring. So super excited about that.
Thanks, Matthew. I wanted to, of course, start with the land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge that I live on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy that comprises the Siksika, the Piikani and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And I wanted to add to this in looking at what the university provides around land acknowledgements. There's not only the slide with the acknowledgement, but there's some very meaningful essays and perspectives that are shared on the website. And one of them that has really stuck with me since I read it last year was to encourage us to think about what does it mean to read or to say these acknowledgements? Do we go beyond just reading the slide? And what does it mean to each of us individually where we are in our lives to be giving that acknowledgement? And for me, in the last several months, I've been doing some workshops on truth and reconciliation. And one of the things that I think in giving that acknowledgement is the realization that I am also one of the people of Treaty 7. And I have a responsibility to understand the history of the treaty and how it is still impacting all of us today. And one of the things that was really informative for me, in my understanding of being part of Treaty 7 was the book that's also shown here on the slide, The True Spirit and Original Intent of Treaty 7. And I wanted to share that with you as a recommendation for a resource if you are also interested in learning more about being part of Treaty 7. The book is a collection of the Indigenous perspectives on Treaty 7. It is the oral histories that have been passed down through the elders of the various peoples of Treaty 7. And it tells us about their worldview and their understanding of the intent of what they were signing when they signed the treaty and how that was very different than what the settlers intended and their worldview. And I think, as I learned in one of the workshops I did this summer, we can't just move to reconciliation. we have to learn the truth and understand the truth. And for me, reading this book was hugely informative, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. I know time is a scarce resource for all of us, but it is really a worthwhile thing to look at. So I wanted to share that with you before we get into the rest of our session. So in this session, Matthew and I are hoping that you will come away with a good understanding and being able to describe what a class representative's approach involves, and to be able to explain and share the benefits of that approach from both a student perspective and an instructor perspective, and to have a bit of time to think about, if this seems like a good fit for you, how you might incorporate class reps into your teaching in your classroom. And how we're going to structure this is I'll start by sharing my path to using class representatives in my course. And together, Matthew and I will describe for you how it has worked in my classes. One of the things about the approach is it's easily modified for different people's contexts. Then we'll each share what we see as the benefits of class representatives from both students and instructors' perspectives. We do want to make sure that you have some time to think about how this could work, what challenges or problems you see, and to chat with Matthew and I about those questions or how we might have dealt with those issues. So I'll start by talking about how I came to use this approach in my classes. And, in thinking about our classes, one of the things we think about is how well is the course working? Are we, when we design our courses, we have plans for how we want the class activities to run and what we want the students to get out of those activities, or what we want them to take away from lectures. And how do we assess how well that's happening? In an ideal world, which this image is not necessarily an ideal world because it's pretty traditional and everybody's white, and the guy teaching the course is a guy. It's not very diverse in that way, but in some ways that gives us an ideal course, that it's small. We have lots of opportunity to walk around and talk with students while they are working on material, so we can get a sense of what's working for them and what's not. We can get to know them and learn directly from them where the problems are and how things are working. For many of us, though, the reality is more like this. And this was certainly when I started teaching at the U of C. I had a class of 400 students in the science theaters. The lights were down quite low so that they could all see the overhead projector that I was teaching with, because that was the technology at the time. And it is really hard, if not impossible, to interact with the students in the same way you would in a smaller class. You can't even see all of their faces in the classroom. And so it's much harder to find out what's working and what's not. And for me, certainly in my early teaching here at U of C, the other thing that happened in those kinds of classrooms was a real feeling of disconnection from my students. I was up at the front behind the overhead projectors, and they were this sort of wall of faces that I was looking at. I didn't feel that same sense of connection. Often in these large classes, how we get student feedback is what I would call a snapshot evaluation, and usually at the end of term. And there are some limitations to these kinds of evaluations that I'm sure you are familiar with to some extent. As I said, they're a snapshot, so they only tell you at one point in time how things are. And often that's at the end of term, when it is too late to act on any of the feedback that you get. It's really useful for planning for next time, but for fixing things now, it's too late. They're often quite uninformative, relatively speaking. And obviously the image I've shared here is an exaggeration of how uninformative they can be. But the USRI scores, you'll receive a score of 4 out of 7, but you don't really know, what does that 4 mean? Why is it a 4? What would make it better? What would strengthen it? Even the written evaluations that we can do are not as informative as they could be, because there's no opportunity for dialogue or to find out more from students about what exactly was the issue and how could I improve. Having said that about these sorts of evaluations, I want to say that there are ways to pull the information out of them and use them to guide our teaching. And certainly the later sessions in the sequence about student feedback and working with student feedback will look in more depth at how we can use evaluations to inform our teaching, what are some of the biases inherent in them, and how do we deal with that. So I am not going to spend a lot of time on them, and I know I've pasted them in quite a negative perspective here, but there's more nuances to them than what I presented here. What I do want to focus on, though, is a very different approach to obtaining and working with student feedback. And that's an approach where you are collecting feedback throughout the term. And this approach, which involves class representatives, is something that I think was probably the single most important change I made in my teaching. And luckily, I talked to someone between my first and second year of teaching. I talked to a colleague at the University of Alberta who used class representatives. And while I have tweaked it and changed it from what this colleague, Bev Mitchell at the U of A did, I think it has not only provided me with good student feedback over the years, but it also changed the whole atmosphere of my courses. So I think it is one of the most important things I ever did. And in sharing with you how I have used class reps, Matthew and I are going to talk to you about these 5 steps or these 5 components of this approach. So recruiting the class reps, creating an environment that supports and makes it safe to be a class rep. How do the class reps manage discussions among themselves, and how do they communicate with other students? And then how does the instructor respond to what the class reps provide as feedback? So in terms of recruiting class reps, I typically would show a slide that looks just like this one. I would also put this on D2L, but I always put it up in the first class and often repeated it in the first few classes, since it takes a while to actually, for everyone to respond. But I would just show that I wanted volunteers. I would outline the duties as indicated here. And then I would just ask anyone that was interested to email me with an indication of what days and times would work for them. Then I would pull that information together and choose the day and time that worked for the most people, including me. And not everybody would be available at that day and time, unfortunately. And I would always send out an email thanking them and saying I welcomed them to come and talk to me anyway. But usually I would end up with a group of, 8 to 10, sometimes a dozen people that could all meet at the same time. And initially I sometimes worried about, oh, that's too many. I've got too many students. How will I ever find a room that we can all meet in? But having too many is really not a problem, because not everybody can attend every week. And there's always a bit of attrition that some people just drop out over the term. So I don't think it's really a problem to have too many class reps. The weekly meeting is about 45 minutes. So it's not a huge time commitment for you as the instructor. There's not a lot of prep that you have to do. I would send out a reminder email ahead of time. Sometimes I would have specific questions I wanted them to think about, and I would send that out in that email. But it's 30 minutes, 45 minutes once a week, and it is a really enjoyable time in the week, I found. And we'll talk more about what made it so enjoyable, but it is not a huge time commitment. In those weekly meetings, the key thing that you are doing as the instructor is trying to reduce that power differential that exists. You aren't going to eliminate it, because you are still the instructor and they are still students in your class, but you are reducing it as much as you can to make it an environment where the students know that they can be honest and open, and that you are listening respectfully to what they have to say, and making an informal environment goes a long way to creating that kind of atmosphere. So I would book a room outside of the classroom just so that we're getting out of that environment. Although it can work to stay in the same classroom if there's not another class after yours. And I would always bring snacks in the before times when we were meeting in person. So the image shows pizza. I never did pizza, I did Timbits. And we would always start with introductions, very much like an icebreaker that you would do at a conference, for example, where you're inviting people to share something about themselves. So the highlight of their holidays or their pets or something to help you get to know each other as people. And I will turn it over to Matthew at this point to talk about student perspective on creating the atmosphere amongst the class reps and communicating with other students.
Thank you, Dr. Addy. And yeah, so class rep meetings, since I was a fall 2021 class rep, it looked a bit different than a typical class rep session, but class rep meetings would occur after class and Dr. Addy would open the Zoom meeting and give us class reps around 20 minutes to discuss things on our own. And in these discussions, we would bring forth concerns we received from our peers with regards to the course assignments, just the course itself, and perhaps issues with potential deadlines. Dr. Addy did mention creating an appropriate environment, and we as class reps wanted to foster the same kind of environment within each other. And these 20 minutes function like an open discussion where we encouraged everyone to contribute what they heard from their peers. During our first meeting, we also set down some ground rules and expectations that we had for each other as class reps. And obviously these included, the basic, just have respect for each other. But our primary goal was always that we would try to best serve the needs of the class rather than, and we would not use this position to kind of serve our own personal agendas. In terms of collecting feedback from our peers, Bio 435 was a course with a lot of team-based lab assignments. And this is often where we would receive our feedback, questions, and concerns. However, some courses are not team-based, and this can be easily mitigated now in the advent of social media, where there are often class discords put in place where a majority of students just join the Discord for information about the course. And we felt as class reps, this worked really well, as we would just have weekly check-ins as class reps, asking in the general forum if the students had any concerns to be brought up during the class rep meeting. And students were fairly receptive to this. And we felt that this way we were able to accurately capture the student voice.
Thank you, Matthew. I would just add, since Matthew didn't have the opportunity to be part of a class rep group in the before times, I just wanted to describe how the meetings ran when we were all in person. So after we would get together in the room and I'd hand out the Timbits and get them circulating, I would just remind the students if there were questions that I'd sent them ahead of time, or if I had any questions that came up at the start of the meeting, I would just remind them of here's some things I'd like us to be able to discuss. And then I would leave the room and just wander around in the hallway. And I'd stand at some distance down the hallway so that then when they would know I wasn't overhearing their discussions. And then when they were ready, one of them would just come out and wave at me and I would join them. And one of the reasons I think that's an important step is so that if there is something contentious or challenging that the students are going to bring up, it comes from them as a group after they've discussed it, rather than if I stayed in the room and someone just mentioned that, it could seem like they were the student with that issue as opposed to coming from the group. So it gives them a chance to present something as a group rather than as an individual. I would also share the emails of the class reps with the other students on D2L. And I think that's kind of a reflection of my age, that I always think, oh, how will they communicate with each other? They'll email each other. So I do make their emails available if they are all in agreement with that. But as Matthew indicated, I think the students have different avenues for communication, and I'm not sure how often they ever got email, but it's another way of signaling to the rest of the class that here is a way for you to share your perspective with us. The last step in the process is, what does the instructor do with this feedback? So this slide just summarizes how the system works, with the students feeding information and concerns and ideas to the class reps, who then discuss them with the instructor. And as the instructor, it's important to be reflecting and not responding, or not responding, sorry, reflecting and not reacting to the feedback. So it's important to make sure that your role is primarily listening and asking questions to draw out what they're saying, and as much as possible, not being defensive. And often the environment is not one where you feel like you're going to be defensive, but there are those times when the students are providing feedback that can be challenging to hear. And if one is defensive, it can really shut down that open and honest communication. So the important thing is to remember that you do not have to respond right at that time. You can say, thanks for that feedback. I'm going to think about it and I will get back to you. And it's also important to remember that you do not have to make changes. Sometimes the students are asking for things that will just not work, or that really are not things you agree with. But you do have to provide a rationale for why that is the policy, or why that isn't going to change. So it is part of that dialogue. And sometimes when I have come back with, well, here's the problem, this is why I can't change it, we've had further discussion and have come up with a compromise of some sort that's in between what they were asking for and where I am at. The other thing that's really important, in addition to reflecting and responding, is to report back to the class as a whole. And I don't think the way I drew the arrow here really captures that, but I would always report to the class after a class rep meeting saying, I met with the class reps on Friday, here's what we talked about, here's what's happening as a result. And sometimes there weren't any big changes to announce, but it was just so you know, here's what we've talked about, and here's what we agreed on, or here's what we think we're going to do. And the students can then talk to the class reps again, or talk to me, but they are part of the loop of this feedback and response. And I see that there's a question. Did you want to?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Claire.
Okay, great. I was just curious, when you kind of tell the class, like what you just said, like tell the class about like this is what we discussed and whatever. Yep. Do you find that you get kind of a lot of questions and like extra comments in class, or is this kind of like how much time does this take up? Like it's not that I would be opposed to questions, but I'm just kind of of my class that I'm teaching, that thinking about implementing something like this is like the pace is like pretty intense. So.
Right, I hear you. Sometimes I would email. In the last 2 years in particular, I was corresponding really often by email. So there'd sort of be a Friday wrap up, and I'd often put the class rep stuff in there, or I'd send out a separate email. I didn't find that there were very many questions. There might have been one or two. If it was something like, I talked to the class reps and we have agreed we're going to change the deadline for this assignment to this. Usually what I would say is, if you've got questions or concerns, please come up and chat with me after class. And so there might be one or two questions like, is that October 11th or 12th? But it didn't open things up for a whole lot of discussion. Matthew, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, no, I thought that there weren't too many questions after class, and things didn't really hamper any speed of course delivery or anything like that.
Yeah, I think there were times when I'd have maybe 2 or 3 things to discuss, and putting those in an email seemed to really help.
Yeah, the weekly Friday emails were great.
Yeah, I would say reporting in wasn't something that caused delays in class, because I'm with you that classes were really busy and things had to happen on time. There's also a question in the chat about how frequent are meetings with class reps. So those were once a week for 30 to 45 minutes. And this is a question for Matthew. Do students get overwhelmed with the additional volunteer workload?
I don't think so. Definitely. Again, it was only 45 minutes. It wasn't a huge time commitment, and there wasn't too much prep on our end because we would use those meetings to discuss questions that we received anyways. And more often than not, like there were most weeks there were not really any concerns whatsoever. So the 45-minute class rep meeting would maybe be 25 or 30 minutes, and it was just more just a fun place to chat. And if you were busy, you could leave early or anything like that. So
yes, absolutely. It's not something, if a student has an exam or something, they will just email and say, I can't be there. And they might share something they were going to bring up in the meeting in that email. And as Matthew alluded to, the meetings often get shorter as the term progresses and you've dealt with a lot of the things that are concerns or anxieties for students. The class rep meetings can end up being, discussions about the course content for sure, but also, students' plans for, questions about graduate school or applying for letters of reference, or how do they talk to other profs about research. It just opens up for sort of broader conversations about being a student and other issues. And I would agree with the comment in the chat. It really was a highlight of my week. It was a time to connect with the students and just find out who they are and how they are. Okay, I will continue on since I think it's now time for you to hear a little bit more from Matthew about the student perspective and benefits.
yeah, so I just quickly wanted to share why I became a class rep in the first place. Like in my first 2 years of university, I was really kept to myself. I wasn't really involved in the extracurricular club activities, and I just felt this would be a great way to get involved. And like Dr. Addy mentioned at the start of the term, it seemed to be very little time commitment, and yeah, it just seemed like something I was interested in doing. And I also thought that it would be a great way to interact with my peers, with fellow peers in my major, and a great way to know one of my professors better. And in a class with so many students, it's kind of hard to build these relationships. So I thought this was a good way to do so. Like, to be quite honest, at first, I was not sure how much change that we as class reps could provide. Prior to Dr. Addy's class, none of my previous classes utilized class reps. And in some cases, this was somewhat frustrating. I'm not going to name any course codes, but there's always seemed to be this giant wall between students and teachers. And there were clear barriers in communication between students and teachers, and often concerns about the course, assignments, test material. They were often left unanswered. And as a student, it's somewhat demoralizing to be in a class where the student voice is not heard. And I was hoping that we could bridge the gap between the professor and the student and improve the learning experience for everyone. And after the first couple meetings or so, I quickly realized how valuable having class representatives were. And in the next slide, I'll just kind of go over the benefits of utilizing class representatives from a student perspective as well. So just on a personal note again, I just wanted to quickly share the benefits that I reaped from this experience. By nature, I'm actually a pretty shy person, and I mostly kept to myself in my first 2 years. And I think it's just a great way to get involved within the school community and just feel more integrated into extracurricular activities and I guess learning after. And I thought it was a great way to kind of just break out of my shell and get to know one of my professors. And this was always maybe more of a me thing, but I've always viewed professors as this huge authority figure, and I was always somewhat scared to ask them about questions about course content, or being as I'm in biosci, I'm always looking for research, so I was kind of scared to ask them about their work and potential spring opportunities for research in their lab. And Dr. Addy was actually one of the first professors that I talked to on a one-on-one basis. And this kind of alleviated my fears of going to office hours or just cold emailing professors for research opportunities. I got to see Dr. Addy and my other professors more as people rather than an authority figure that I could not really approach. But on a broader scale, I think class representatives are integral in improving the student experience. I do know there are many students like myself that are kind of scared of voicing their concerns to professors, and they feel it might be easier to ask questions through a peer rather than directly going to the professor himself. I think that alleviates a lot of the anxiousness of emailing the professor, being scared of not getting a great response or not getting a response at all. So I think to go through a peer is a whole lot easier than going direct to the professor. I think from a course content perspective, it allowed for further clarification of topics that were confusing. So often a question us class representatives would ask to the class Discord was if anybody needed clarifications on the topics in class that we learned. And we would collect the topics people felt were most confusing. And we would bring these forth to Dr. Addy, and then Dr. Addy would then go over these concepts at the start of the next class. But I think the most important benefit of class representatives is I think that every student feels more inclined and motivated to learn if they know their concerns are being heard and acknowledged. As mentioned, it is demoralizing to just know that one's valid concerns about the class are not being heard. And the class representative system gives students a unified voice and makes them feel like they're not some nameless face attending a lecture, that the concerns that they have are valid, and that there is possibility for change within the course structure if it is reasonable.
Thank you, Matthew. My computer is just wanting me to do an updating thing, so I'm trying to encourage it not to do that right now. Sorry, I don't know if you're all seeing this thing flashing up on my screen, but it's kind of in the way. All right. So for me and for instructors, this slide captures one of the key benefits. Sorry, I'm hoping you aren't seeing this thing flash up on your screen.
It's fine, Heather.
Okay.
We're not seeing anything. Thanks.
All right. I will just try to move it out of the way then. So to me, the key thing is it helps me see my class through a new lens. I get a little glimmer of what it's like to be a student in my class. And sometimes people say, well, how can students provide these suggestions for change and have this perspective on the class because they don't know about teaching. And the thing is that students are experts in being students, and they know what works for them and what is going to help them learn, what's going to give them the conditions they need for learning. And some of the places where I found this most useful is in getting that student perspective on an assignment that I think I have designed really carefully, and I think it's really clear. And then I talk to the class reps and I realize that it's not clear, or the way I set it up doesn't achieve what I wanted it to. So for example, I often at the end of my courses, I would have a fairly open-ended final project. So students could pick whatever topic was most of interest to them, and they could choose a format that they thought would help them best demonstrate what they learned. So they could, write a paper, or they could do an art project, or they could make an infographic, all sorts of choices. And I thought this was great in giving them so much choice. And what the class rep said was, well, no, that's really kind of paralyzing, especially at the end of term when we're busy and tired, and more guidelines would be really much better. Or when we moved online, and as Matthew said, my students work in teams, and I had a standard way that I was having the students do peer feedback. And the feedback from the class reps was, everything we're doing is now on Zoom in breakout rooms, and it's really hard to provide this kind of peer feedback when that's the level of interactions that we've had. So they helped me come up with a different approach and a different format for collecting that peer feedback. So to me, this has helped me respond to what's happening in my class in real time and deal with problems as they arise and improve the learning environment for my students week by week. But it's also had the benefit to me of connecting me with my students. And that was one of the things I really struggled with when I first started teaching at U of C, especially in big classes, was that feeling of disconnection. And it helped me feel like this isn't my class. I am doing a lot of the designing and the planning ahead of time, but we are working together as partners in building this environment and in building a class that's going to work for the students and also for me, that I really came to feel like a partnership with the students. And that change in the class atmosphere made all the difference to me as well. There were some weeks, as I said, where the class rep meeting was the highlight, that it energized me and reminded me of why I wanted to teach in the first place.
Greatly appreciate Dr. Heather Addy and Matthew Chu for their presentation this afternoon and for launching the first of our series of making sense of student feedback. I think someone did mention how great it was to have a student perspective. So thank you, Matthew, for joining us. And thank you, Heather, for inviting Matthew and coming up with this session. So it was extremely valuable. And I think we've learned a lot from this.